Okay, so we're just going to talk briefly about fetch before we actually start writing code. So we're going to be writing out code where we make a GET request to an API and get data back. And to do that, we will be using what is known as the fetch API. So fetch is inbuilt into JavaScript, and it essentially is a new and modern way that allows us to make HTTP requests over the internet or the World Wide Web to get data. So what we're going to do is we're going to be using the fetch API to essentially fetch data, okay? So when you're working with the fetch API, we're just going to call it fetch, like Mean Girls, fetch. Anyway, the fetch API will expect to receive some sort of URL, okay? And this URL will be the URL or the API endpoint that we are trying to talk to or get data from. So in a previous tutorial, I actually showed you an endpoint that you can use to get random cat data and even to get the latest Bitcoin price, okay? So we're going to have to understand various things as well, such as promises, etc. But when we get a response back from an API, we're going to get a response that is known as a promise, okay? So if everything works out, the promise will eventually resolve to a response object, i.e. the data we need. What we can then do is use .then to essentially see the data or catch, if we need to catch an error, okay? So speaking to an API, there's a few different steps you have to go through. It's not just as simple as writing fetch, pasting in a URL, and then you get the data back in the format that you want. We're going to have to speak a bit about promises and then using a method known as .json. Just a quick point to note, Internet Explorer does not support the use of the fetch API. At least that was the case last time I checked. So I'll be using Google Chrome. And then at a very basic level, this is a very basic example of a fetch request. We are going to use fetch to basically send a request to get a random cat fact back. Then what we're going to do is chain on the .then method. We will call the response, we get back the response, and then we're just going to log it out to the console to see what we get, okay? So we've covered now over the last few tutorials, we've done a lot of theory, we've spoke about what an API is. We know an API is basically a server somewhere and we can send a GET request to get data back. I've now told you we're going to use the fetch API to send that request. We can hit or speak to an API endpoint to get data back, and that will come in the form of JSON. So we've covered now the basics of what an API is in theory. The last few tutorials are very much theory focused. So the next few tutorials now we're going to actually start writing some code. We have quite a bit to learn, so I'm looking forward to being on that journey with you. So I'll see you in the next tutorial.